Hi, I'm Chris DiBona. I'm not your moderator. I work for Google looking after open source software, both incoming and outgoing. So I think that's why Joi asked me to be on this unconferencey panel. So that's my introduction. I pass it on to
Yeah, I'm John Seeley Brown, the co-chair of the Center for the Edge, and always in search for Joi. And just a second, here he is.
Everyone close your eyes. He's here. All right. And his mic's off.
We're here to introduce Joi. As I said, I go by the name JSB of John Seeley Brown. I used to run Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, and with Deloitte Center for the Edge and University of California, Southern California, with the Provost Office. My particular interest is kind of new ways that knowledge is flowing and new ways to organize, et cetera, and we'll come back to some of these topics in a bit.
My name's Larry Lessig, and I teach at Harvard, and I was one of the co-founders of Creative Commons and have done my time in the IP battles trying to bring some rationality to the way in which the law wants to intervene in the creative process.
My name is Yochai Benkler. I also teach at Harvard, and I've been spending a lot of time thinking about commons-based strategies for innovation and information production, collaboration, human motivation, diverse motivations in open innovation, creativity, participation.
And I'm Joi, and I'm late, and I apologize. And so as you can clearly see, we probably didn't have time to discuss what we were going to talk about ahead of time. But I read John Seeley Brown's book, which said the power of pull is about pulling the resources together as you need them and counting on serendipity. So I hope that that works today. But also, I also know that you fail quickly and you fail often, but you learn from your mistakes. One of the themes through the conference has been about networks and about open networks. I talked at the beginning of the event a lot about open innovation. And I think that the reason why I sort of hope to curate this group here is to think about different ways of doing innovation. I think, Yochai, I read your I'll just hit kind of some of the key things. I mean, Yochai, I think it was in the HBS recently where you were talking about how enlightened self-interest seems to be the way people think. Enlightened self-interest in markets is one of the ways, tell me if I'm characterizing this improperly, but seemed to be the thing that was supposed to motivate good things to happen. But actually a lot of people now collaborate and work for other reasons, and because you like to cooperate, you like to show up. And so to think about sort of how innovation happens other than through just self-interest in markets. And Larry, with Creative Commons, we've been, I think, and also earlier, I mean, for me, one of the really important things that I also mentioned yesterday was when you wrote code, and you told me that you had programmers and developers come up to you. Code is about how software is actually political, and architecture is political. And he had software developers come up to him and say, "I don't want to be political," But the really important thing is that the architecture of the network actually influences whether it. So, for instance, internet is by its DNA fundamentally an open network that allows open innovation. And so I think there's the architecture part of how that works. And JSB, you ran Xerox PARC, but more recently you've been talking a lot about this sort of how innovation happens in open networks. But you also talk about non-internet ways of innovation that I wanted to hear a little bit about. And then we've got Exhibit A, which is Chris, the sort of the. I'm trying to think. I don't want to call you a cheerleader, but you're the open guy from Google. And Google's the most open man at Google. And so I kind of want to understand from you. That didn't come out right, but so I think together what would be interesting is, and maybe we can start out actually. I don't know whoever wants to start first, whether we want to frame it, we want to use your example, and whether you want to even talk about the things that I pinned on each of you. But it'd be really interesting to see how you're thinking about Google, and especially in the context of Google, you use open a lot. I want to know how much you actually are open. I mean, one of the arguments that we've had recently was I just realized, when you come to MIT, the guy who made TCP/IP is over there, the guy who invented the web is over there. All the standards guys seem to be kind of on the West Coast. There's Hal. And then everybody on the West Coast exploits standards and then sometimes even closes them. And then, so I mean, I don't want to actually, I do want to put you on the spot. So that's kind of just asks you about how you think about it. But those are sort of roughly the topics I thought would be interesting and kind of converge around. I don't know who wants to start.
So there's a long. Is my mic on? Number 2. So there's a long tradition of people taking standards, trying to extend them into something that they can control, and then locking them down. You see this all the time. In some ways, my first introduction to the concept of open source and intellectual property came in 1994, 1993. I was working for a law firm as an IT nerd, looking after their email network. And I was in an elevator with a lawyer, and Netscape had just gone public or something, or they were being very prominent. And he said, you internet kids, you didn't get it figured out. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, well, if you had properly protected your intellectual property around networks, we could charge a penny per packet sent over that network of yours. And I said to him, well, there were plenty of options that were charging that much, and we chose the ones that didn't, that were open to us, that we could just expand without talking to guys like you. And he's like, oh, yeah, I guess that makes sense. And I'm like, yeah, because, of course, what's flowing in the back of my mind is, Banyan Vines and SNA. And I'm like, and what a pain in the butt those protocols were to work with, right? I mean, I'm sure, from Park, you know all about this. But it's like, and then you had TCP IP, and it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, and routing was hard, and nobody really could tell you if mail would actually flow if you sent something to an @whatever address. But, it worked, and nobody was stopping you. And that sort of became my sort of guiding philosophy in a lot of ways. Open source was not about really just giving things away. It was about no one was trying to stop you, right? And there was no one waiting there just trying to pick your pocket on the way through the original early internet, right? That didn't come until video started hitting the internet. And so it's like, it ended up being this fantastic medium for us to grow in, right? And so open source grew along with the internet, and the internet grew along with open source because we were the only people who could keep up with each other, right? And so you had some modicum of commercial activity there, and now obviously a lot more. But I don't think one could have existed without the other. And those standards were expressed as open source software. Otherwise, they failed.
Right. So instead of freedom as in free beer, it's freedom to innovate.
Freedom to innovate.
Right?
Yes, that's
but
very
basically
true.
Without asking permission, freedom to do stuff.
Not having to ask permission, yeah. So.
But in some sense, the internet protocols got off the ground through request for comments.
Yeah.
I mean, so it was a very interesting social institution. They found a kind of a way to formalize getting the community on board and trying to get the best out of everybody.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. Yeah. I'd say that's true. And if you look at the early pioneers of the internet, they were very collaborative people.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
And Yochai, but I want to sort of get to you and sort of this element. So, but the why do you do this part, right? Because I think a lot of the internet was designed by people who are doing it because they wanted to, just for the heck of it, right? Because there's that kind of hacking and a lot of the open source stuff. But then you've got people who make money doing it, right? And then the relationship between that, and then and then we have things like the Mozilla Foundation, which is partially run like a business, and then it involves. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on sort of the actors in this space.
So there are these two complementary elements. One is the micro motivational, and the other is the macro effect, right? The idea that freedom to appropriate is more important than power. Freedom to operate is more important than power to appropriate is very central when there's high uncertainty about what the next round of innovation is. There's a room for a lot of experimentation, a lot of failure, and a lot of pickup. I'm not copying it too well, am I? Borrowing, learning quickly. The idea of being able to essentially continuously teach each other and learn from each other. So some of it can be even done on fairly simple models of we're all trying to move together, we're all trying to move as fast as we can in a very uncertain environment, explore as much of the environment as possible, teach each other, move from one place to the other, convey knowledge. These are already the old studies of the differences between Silicon Valley and Route 128, when Annalise Saxenian wrote about, and Ron Gilson wrote about, where essentially Route 128 was constrained in the degree to which embodied knowledge, knowledge that people had, tacit knowledge that people had, couldn't move between firms because you had enforcement of non-competes in a way that you didn't have in California. And then the culture locally adapts to the fact that you can't effectively constrain someone to actually take pride in the fact that people circulate. So these are macro level effects where knowledge that is by its nature very hard to codify, very hard to transfer from place to place, transfers through conversations and doing and learning from each other in an environment where there's a lot of flow. And the same happens with open standards when you basically don't need permission from the 1 or 2 or 3 people who are insiders to run something at the macro level. What you're referring to, I think, which is something that I've really more been working on in the last 5 years and just this HBS piece, the book that just came out, is the other thing is that we've been operating on a model of human motivation that is, we all know in some sense is wrong, but was considered to be a good enough approximation. Sort of enlightened self-interest, not just crass self-interest, but basically long-term self-interest translatable into material, rewards, punishment. But in fact, what you see when you look at a range of disciplines from evolutionary biology through social psychology to experimental economics to political science to organizational sociology, that's obviously just not true, not at least in observed experimental settings. People in experiments show that they care about empathy and face-to-face matters. People care about solidarity and a sense of group and doing something that's part of the group. People care about doing what is moral. People care about being treated fairly. And unlike the standard simplistic model of self-interest, when you actually measure in experiments and in field observations across a wide range of fields, some people really are materially self-interested much of the time. Some of us, all of us in some sense perhaps, we don't know all or how, are materially self-interested and very directed at certain times. But we mostly occupy a wide range of motivations and we're very tied to the particular context. So this can be shop floor practices that have process engineers that are looking over the shoulder versus teamwork in things that are 20, 25 years old. Classic Toyota production system. Why am I saying all of this? You should be saying it. You asked me. So the basic point is we lived for a long time under a model that didn't fit what in fact practices were pursued. And increasingly now what we're seeing is that as we look more carefully, we see that we are diversely motivated and that we need to begin to build systems related to these motivations. And when you look at open source software, when you look at Wikipedia, when you look at one of so many of the other collaborative production projects, what you actually see is not things that are driven by reward, but things that are driven much more by social signaling, by a sense of mission and a sense of purpose, a sense of community that are real as opposed to just made up.
I think a kind of spin on that, a way to collapse some of this is, you talk about motivation. Think about it in terms of how do we create our identity. It was the case that to the 20th century person, we created our identity mostly by what we wore, owned, controlled. But today's networked age kids actually see themselves much more of creating a sense of themselves or an identity by what they create, what they share, but also what other people build on what they have done. And so there's a kind of very interesting shift of who am I, and you might call it reputational capital, but this whole sense that I can create something, share it, but somebody else can build on it. And you start to get your exponential payoffs through that kind of process. It turns out to be a very nice amplifier of a sense of who we are, which you made legal for us.
Yeah, so I feel like most of my work in this space has been the work of a lawyer with a guilty conscience. So here's a way into this. My former colleague, Mark Lemley, wrote this wonderful little piece about nanotechnology. And midway through the piece, he kind of remarked in passing, he said, if you think about all the fundamental technologies of the 20th century, computer, hardware, software, biotech technologies. All of those fundamental technologies were either by accident or intentionally free. So they tried to patent the computer. The patent office rejected it. Software was not considered protectable in any effective way for most of the 20th century. Watson and Crick, certainly did not want DNA protected in any effective way through IP. So these fundamental technologies were free, and then on top of these free technologies, people innovated, and they got IP for the innovations on top. As they switched to the 21st century, all of the fundamental technologies, all the way down to the nano level, are radically buried inside of IP. So, 5 years ago, he wrote this. The carbon nanotube technologies have about 214 patents around carbon nanotube technologies. Now, people outside the law, who interpret the world in a charitable way, look at that and they think, well, geez, the lawyers must have sat down around 1995 and looked at the 20th century and said, there's not enough innovation in the 20th century. We need to ramp up the incentives in the 21st century so we can really max out on.
Where's my penny per packet?
That's, well, yeah, something like that. And the reality is, of course, nobody thought through any of that change. There was never any kind of master plan that kind of worked out that it would be better to radically change the environment within which we innovated. It just was the kind of accidental consequence of certain structures and ways of thinking about IP that kind of like some big monster robot, that has like a 6 months old intelligence of bouldering along, crushing things in its way, incapable of understanding the damage that it's doing. That is the law, right? That's the law. And I think that part of what people like, lawyers like me, Yochai is one of these lawyers too, the lawyers with the guilty conscience, trying to do is to figure out how to motivate people outside of the law to be sufficiently and properly disrespectful of the law. Now, I don't mean by that go out and break the law, but I do mean by that, well, Yochai does, but I definitely don't mean that. I do mean by that be much more critical and demand justification from the law. Because the real problem we have is that you would think that this system might self-correct, that at a certain point it kind of recognizes, it grows up from being a 6-month-old to a 5-year-old and says, oh, geez, I'm really doing a lot of damage. But the particular architecture of the law happens to benefit some people really well. And those people, the incumbents, then leverage their enormous power inside of our deeply corrupted political system to block any effective reform of the bumbling, stupid way in which the law crushes all sorts of creative innovation. And so this is not a system that's going to self-correct. It's not going to fix itself. And until, in my view, the political system gets fixed, it's not going to fix itself. So what we've got to do is to figure out ways that people who can recognize the harmful effect can work around it and build around it and implement systems that take advantage of the norms or the potential gains from innovation that comes from sharing in this particular way without ever assuming that we're going to get the law stuff fixed. So that's the work that Hal and I were, two of the people that were involved in the launching of Creative Commons many, many years ago. That's some of the work that other people are doing in similar projects to figure out how we can sort of neutralize the harmful effect, but in a way that really pushes the great opportunity of innovation that comes from this new mode of creating and sharing and building on other people's work.
But how do you really feel? So there's this, and to tie it back a little bit to this code is law, and it's kind of a chicken and an egg piece too, right? Because the architecture definitely changes, and assuming that law is part of architecture, and so it's the reverse. The architecture definitely influences the way we can behave within the system. And part of the internet was that we just kind of, part of it was people weren't watching, and there were a few enlightened politicians who kind of let it slide, and so we were able to kind of do it out of band. I think being far away on the West Coast was part of it. The non-compete stuff was part of it, and so it was kind of a hack, and we got away with it because they weren't paying attention. I think it's harder when you try to do it in areas that they're paying attention. But I do think it's kind of an interesting chicken and egg, because you can kind of attack the architecture and come up with things like Creative Commons, or you can kind of mobilize enough people, like the Arab Spring, well, you could always overthrow the government. I mean, not that I don't think this is going to be as easy in the United States. Occupy New York doesn't. It's not that. But still, it's interesting to try to figure out which part of the system you start working on first. So one is to try to come up with an alternative architecture. The other is, I mean, like Wikipedia, and you have these projects that start to get, because one of the things that was interesting is if you look at, for instance, the electric vehicle, and where the automobile companies flipped from being against and spending millions of dollars trying to destroy the electric vehicle to them flipping on and supporting electric vehicle was when the market told them that they wanted the electric vehicle. And so that was enlightened self-interest changing policy that changed laws, that changed architecture changes. So, I mean, if we're thinking about sort of the future of open innovation, I mean, where do you think we should, so Larry, you described like kind of, okay, we get that it's hard, but I think changing Congress is probably sounds pretty hard too. So what should we do next? I mean, and we have the Media Lab, which is a great place to test a lot of things. But I mean, where do we go next in terms of trying to take Yochai's thing? How do we make a world where people who aren't motivated necessarily by self-interest go in order to feel? Because that's the problem, I think. And I don't. I'm sorry. I'm going to keep rolling, but we can come back. Is like Google. I'm going to put you on the spot again. I mean, I think a lot of people join Google that are like that, the kind of people who just like to hack, right? But on the other hand, but it's still an environment where you still have shareholders. At the end of the day, the majority of your engineers are going to be working on jobs where their focus isn't as broad and open as you, right? So is there a way to hack the system where we can just have a bunch of people who are that we have more people just focusing on what they want to do? Any ideas?
Yeah, I can really only say how we handle it at Google, which is, I just try to keep the company out of the way of the people who want to release software and want to release technology out into the larger world of computer science, right? So it does get hard, though, in the current litigation climate, because most often when we release technology, it's under a patent-granting Apache license. And so getting people to recognize that this is a good thing and not a bad thing, and that it supports our defensive posture and doesn't hurt it, I mean, it can be quite challenging, especially as a company grows into its maturity the way that Google has. We have a certain profile of turnover, both in legal and in engineering, and keeping people reminded that it's okay to release things when, up until that point, everything that every lawyer has been taught has been about locking things down. And every engineer has been told that everything they do is this magical, beautiful jewel that needs to be protected inside a little box. It's extremely challenging. And so, we hit that all the time and every day. And so I would just start by certainly fundamentally changing everything we do to train lawyers and engineers, but, just trying to get the word out that this isn't the end of computer science if you share information with each other. In fact, it can make you much more powerful and much stronger. So it's really hard, though. I'm not going to lie to you.
Yeah, but the other half of that is, I am constantly
litigation changes.
Yeah, but your comment about resisting the lawyers who've been trained and think that the thing to do is lock stuff down. You really have to take a kind of cultural understanding of the law to recognize it's going to be 20 years before the lawyers are flushed through the system who were trained in the 1970s or 1980s about how to think about this stuff to the lawyers who were trained in a world where they could read Yochai's work or stuff that suggested to them there's a different model. And lawyers love to put on the suit and the authority of their badge and insist that what they're talking about is truth. When, quite frankly, as someone who produces lawyers for a living, they don't know squat about most of the stuff that they're talking about in this context, and yet they are successful in terrifying really intelligent, talented people into restricting the scope of what they'd want to do. So
and it's easy to say lawyers are bad, and I really don't want to say that.
I did. I said
so. Okay. Because they're, the best of them. Even many of the middle.
It's okay for minorities to mock themselves.
I guess so. Seem open to it, and it's funny. In some ways, the lawyers from before the great growth of intellectual property are easier to deal with, in some ways, than some of the more modern lawyers who have been trained up on patent, 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 patent. You know, so.
I mean, I also think it's important to realize you got your 20-year lag to build your new breed, but during this 20-year period, I mean, as you've already seen today, walking and yesterday through the multiple floors here at your wonderful new operation in the new building, our ability to build things has been radically transformed. So it used to be that we could build things really cool in our garages digitally. Okay, but now we have these power tools that enable us to, to transform material science, where you can literally build new nanoparticles almost in your garage. How you can do all kinds of new types of things, where this
like
edge,
the variable silicons that we saw downstairs.
Okay,
I mean, it's amazing.
And it's truly amazing. So part of the catch now is more and more of the world is almost moving toward the world of fashion. That is to say, something that only has an immediate, a life expectancy before it gets replaced by something else of a very shrinking period of time. In that kind of a world, the ability to constantly maintain yourself at the cutting edge is going to be a substantial competitive edge. It's going to take lawyers more years to be able to fight something out that we've already completely gone beyond it. I mean, I know it's optimistic.
It's really, really
optimistic. Let's get that in writing.
Insanely optimistic here, because the question is not what you can do, it's where you can do it. Because in a world where these crazy, obscure patent claims exist in the background, the only people who can innovate in the patent fields are those who have large enough stockpiles of patents to be able to fight the other side here. So you guys have been in the middle of this kind of stuff all the time.
So this is a very popular thing to say for a very good reason. It's true, right? Unfortunately, over the last year, we had a titanic change in the people who were being threatened by small patent, non-practicing patent entities, right? The Lotus patents being the most well known, but it's like they're finally going after the people who are making 10 grand from an app, not just going after Google with its enormous stockpiles of cash, right? So those people are incredibly incentivized to pay 5 grand and not go to court for millions, or hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of legal fees. So that's been a huge change. You didn't see that 5 years ago. Before it was big companies deciding not to fight each other, or big companies fighting each other, or really medium companies being crushed by big companies. But the little guy wasn't hurt. Now, basically, the little guys are being taxed by a lawyer in East Tyler, Texas. It's just it's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, and you have to understand what the tax is. The tax is not just the $5,000 you've got to pay at the end of the cycle. Yeah. The tax is the $250,000 you've got to pay to the lawyer through the whole cycle of fighting this, right? So the point is, this is a tax that obliterates the opportunity for the guy in the garage to be making new nanoparticles, right? He's going to be making these inventions only inside of relatively large organizations that can provide this legal infrastructure. And again, if there were anything to justify the need for this huge legal infrastructure, I'd be for it. I'd be okay with it. But when you stand here in a world where the skepticism around the actual good that's being done by this legal structure is as high as it is outrageous that we continue to manufacture, even this latest patent bill is another sort of spin on this, manufacture this legal infrastructure that will just shift innovation from the place it could happen, the garages, into the places that are, in some sense, the least innovative. Not to say you're the least innovative, but in marginal space, the least innovative.
Let me push back a little bit on back to the optimism side.
Come downstairs with me.
So this is essentially the model of rolling our own, rolling an open alternative, which is not, I think, just pie in the sky. So when Craig Ventnor says he's going to sequence the human genome and patent it, there's a major mobilization of scientists, and the public project succeeds in sequencing enough of the genome and putting it out there under the Bermuda Principles immediately that it essentially kills the patent-based business model for DNA sequences and creates that particular research tool, puts it in the public domain. It doesn't mean that there are no problems with gene patents that don't get in the way, but that was a very effective roll our own process. I think if from the perspective of 1994, you were to say in a year Microsoft's going to figure out that web server is the next generation based on a copyright closed model, the web server is going to be proprietary. We're going to start something here, call it Apache, and have it be open source and have that be 60-some% of the market. You wouldn't predict that that would happen, and yet it happens. I think that in the mid-90s, if there were to be an alternative operating system, it was not going to be GNU Linux. I think if you look at 1999, fantastic book, Information Rules, the thing that's going to challenge Britannica is Encarta. Well, no, as it turns out, because we were able to roll our own. Which isn't to say it'll all work out, don't worry and don't work on it, but in terms of where you put your effort, you're putting your effort correctly on fixing the legislative process that creates these barriers. But this building, in some sense, as a strategic task, being able to map a sphere of operation and say, here are strategic interventions that are basic research tools. You know, simple things like we're moving to a ubiquitously connected environment with a mobile network, which means we're no longer running on TCP/IP, we're no longer running on non-proprietary, we're running on proprietary. Okay? Viral telecommunications. Hi, Andy. Do you build something that essentially replaces all of these models on an open network and renders the whole proprietary side there? You know, smart grid markets. I'm now looking at spectrum policy because it's a smart grid communications markets. About 55% on the communication side of the market is provided by unlicensed, either 900 megahertz or 2.4 megahertz. That's more than half the market in smart grids running not on proprietary spectrum. And you can talk spectrum auctions to now to doomsday. It's not proprietary. It's on either Wi-Fi or 900 megahertz. So that's, as a task, I would say, identify strategically significant choke points and build an open alternative. I don't know whether that's feasible in nanotubes. I just don't know the technology.
Yeah, but so are you? So I'd love you to be right as always, and I'd love to believe in your optimism as always. But are you describing a bubble or are you describing a trend? Because I agree with you, the 90s had a whole collection of these amazing things in the early part of the 21st century, these amazing things nobody would have predicted. But are there really that many that are out there that could be as fundamental? Or are we seeing, you know, a couple places where like spectrum is pretty important, but the platforms are increasingly, you know, not TCP, not internet TCP/IP-based platforms. They're more proprietary-based platforms. The innovation is happening within more proprietary places. I mean, do you think the future is as big and as optimistic as it was in the 90s in the early part of this century?
So I don't know. Partly what I was saying was a question of where you focus your energy strategically. Do I know whether Freedom Box will actually do something for purposes of distributed cloud, or will the cloud environment be completely proprietary and controlled? I don't know. It's an interesting, as a solution space, it's an interesting direction to go into. It's where it's what I'd want to have as an infrastructure of first and last resort. Questions of OpenID and the question of whether or not Facebook becomes one place or data becomes portable and protectable. These are all targets that people are working on, and that I know where my strategic preference is. I'm not deterministic enough to say that I know it will work, but I'm not sure why I would think that it's systematically less susceptible to an open innovation model than we saw 10 years ago.
Yeah, so I'm going to say that my comments don't reflect the opinion of the Media Lab at this point. But
I don't think you get to do that.
Well, no, on this particular note, because this is a consensus process. But to get back to your point about enlightened self-interest, and Howard's been talking about collective action, and I think it's really important to the point of that programmer who came up to Larry and said, I don't want to be political. It is political. And to me, there is a choice. And what was scary is I went to an internet class at a major Japanese university, and we did a poll, or the professor did a poll, and asked who should be running the internet. And they said, the poll majority said the police. And that was really scary. These were college students. And then I also look at Facebook and other companies who forget that the only reason they exist is we fought like hell to keep the internet open. We continue to do that. And there's a bunch of older people like me and even older people all the way along the stack who sit around and make political decisions every day to keep the internet open in order to keep innovation open. And this is the kind of thing that kind of pisses me off about some of the little startups, is that they forget that it's because of us geezers that they get
off our lawn.
Yeah, but it was that conversation to not let the guy sit there and take that little penny per packet. But then but I mean, it's natural business self-interest to try to make money on top of that. But I think that it's also incumbent on us to take political action and collective action to try to keep it open. But each layer forgets that the layers below it did this before. And I think that at some level, whether it's an academic institution, whether it's Wikipedians or whatever, but it has to be somewhat intentional, and you have to fight it. And so, of course, you can go and try to overthrow Congress, and we should continue to do, well, not overthrow Congress, change Congress. But sorry, I was thinking about Japan. But I think that's also a critical part. It's not just, you know, sort of a prediction that you make, right? And so then I think about, and again, not speaking on behalf of the Media Lab, how can you normatively cause people to tend to be more open, especially across these layers? And I mean, it's not easy, but you have to change the DNA, and a lot of it is the people who are developing these things.
Do you want to take questions?
Huh?
Do you want to take questions?
Yeah, maybe we should take some questions. We've got about.
We have microphones.
Anybody have any comments? Comments, strong opinions too is fine.
Just end them with a question mark.
Yeah.
I'd like to welcome the panelists to Occupy Media Lab. We see an increasing polarization in our society, and it's not just the left and the right, it's the haves and the have-nots and all that stuff. I'm privileged to be here and see the creativity and the intelligence from major corporations. I've had a lot of talks over the last couple of days from great people of these big, you know, Fortune 500 companies, and they're opening to listening to what we have to say, and they're themselves giving us information that helps us in our research. But the guys in downtown Boston or Wall Street or stuff, they don't get to see what I get to see. And I'm thinking, oh, if they could just, you know, get a little bit more together and understand that it's more nuanced and it's not so black and white and all that. So how can we kind of help us get rid of this extreme division in our society and understand each other better?
And I would, just to add one thing to the Media Lab thing, you know, there are, because it's because it's complex, it's very nuanced, and so this is why I was saying I didn't want to speak on behalf of the Media Lab, but just in that it's not. It's hard. It isn't, like you said, it isn't black and white. And in certain areas, if you're trying to get somebody to spend $50 million on a clinical trial, you need some sort of protection for that investment. If you're trying to create software for an open standard, it's got to be open. So those two ends are kind of obvious. Everything in between starts to become shades of gray. And the tricky part of it is as broken as it is, as Larry says, being an abolitionist of intellectual property also doesn't work. Right, and so that's the tricky part, is you can kind of oversimplify it and just say, let's just give everything away. And then none of these, well, some of the companies might still come, but a lot of these companies, it doesn't work for them. And so I think that the tricky part is that the reconstruction of the future based on a lot of the stuff we're talking about isn't that easy. And the thing is that the internet evolved into a very sophisticated, complex system through small pieces loosely joined, where each of the pieces, as Dave Weinberg would say, aren't that sophisticated, but it was a really interesting network that generated itself, and it wasn't centrally planned. And that's why even though I keep asking for the answer, obviously there isn't an answer, because there's no one simple thing. But at least I don't know it. If you guys know the answer, let me know. But so that's why, you know, fixing or changing the Media Lab with one single swoop isn't going to happen. And I think what's going to happen is this kind of an iterative process as we experiment with all kinds of things. I mean, that's why we're doing this IP commission, to really try to understand it, because it is very complex. But having said that, I think that there's a certain way you can lean. And that's why I want to sort of lean towards open, but be very aware that open doesn't work for everything, because I think there's so much leaning the other direction, so it compensates and averages out to neutral. That would be my balanced and political comment.
I mean, so notice that if in fact, like certain types of drugs, or take the examples I work on, new types of fiber, communication fiber, you may spend 10 years trying to perfect this stuff. And nobody's going to invest 10 years in doing something if you don't have some reason to be able to lock this up and recapture your cost. Part of the thing I was getting at the very beginning in terms of the tools we now have to do innovation is we can do innovation at a fraction of the cost that we used to be able to do. But we're applying the protocols of yesteryear, in which I had to invest $10 to $100 million to do something now I can invest and do with $500,000. So we're completely out of impedance matching here between the kind of protection for something that still requires gigantic amounts of money and patience versus something that has now become infinitely cheaper to do, infinitely easier to do. And so I think we have a mismatch at that dimension. I also think, going back to your wonderful comment about Media Lab, that what I really see happening is how we're moving from an era of, people keep saying, Stanford was the basis of Silicon Valley. I say no, Stanford views itself as a diode. We create and push out to the world. The irony is I'm convinced Stanford gets more from the environment than the environment gets from Stanford. Okay? What you're creating here is an environment where it's not a diode, it's not a push model, but it's a true dialogue. And that's where these ideas really start to happen. Not only do ideas get created, but also a tremendous understanding gets created to have a shared context. And I think that is where a tremendous amount of innovation happens. And I think you begin to understand each other's worlds in quite new ways. What things are expensive, what things aren't, can be afforded to be, not worried about. Now, at Park, maybe we went over over that edge too far, but and so on and so forth. So I think that this is a delicate, almost degenerative dance across that boundary.
So it's a complex, but I think short question, which is a little bit of an advice. Like, if I would have an invention, if someone here would have an invention, the question is, what questions you have to make to answer the question, should it be open? So what questions would you guys ask yourself to decide whether it should be open?
More often than not, I get this actually a lot. And I've sort of defaulted to open as a shorthand. When I look at productization of things that happen in the lab, for instance, by members, sponsors, whatever, or by the students themselves, I keep on thinking that it's not clear what closed does for them. It's not clear what open really means at the lab either. I mean, so again, I don't even know if Google is a proper member of the lab.
You are.
We are? Okay, so.
Welcome.
I guess we're a proper member of the lab now. So that's good.
For some definition of proper.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because there was like the app inventor angle and all that. So I'm yammering at this point. Yeah.
But default to
yeah,
open.
so we've tried to default to open, and specifically open with a defined patent grant, which is very defensive in nature, because that serves our needs. It protects us. It allows us to get technology out there, and we desire that for things like Android and for Chrome and all the rest. So when I look at some of the technologies you've created, it's not clear how many of them can be successful unless you get broad adoption. Some of them are clearly more devices that you could commercialize, and then you could make the financial argument that closing them up and having patents around them and licensing them out is the right model. But how many of them will just sit there and not go anywhere, and could do with a little bit of opening, yeah, I don't want to call it specific projects that I think really should be more open, because that would be kind of unfair to the researchers. But I've seen many projects in the lab that stay in the lab and aren't adopted by members or sponsors and just sit there. And it'd be really, really cool if we could get them out there and find someone who, frankly, is maybe more creative in how to productize them than us. And you could then go down the route of, should we be open sourcing these completely? Should we be giving a patent grant? Should we come up with a reasonable, reasonable and non-restrictive model for patent licensing? I mean, I don't know what the answer is there. But it just seems that you don't want to be in a situation where technology dies in place because you're too controlling. I mean, this happens at Google, by the way. It happened at Park, where technologies that really should have been in everyone's hands somehow didn't get there. And whether it was a lack of vision on our part for not backing them in the market or in some product, I don't know. But it's a shame when you see things die. This happens in pharma all the time. A friend of mine, he had a pharmaceutical company, and they had put together a drug for, of all things, toe fungus, that instead of being a pill, which is very hard on the liver, it was a site injection that would give off the medicine at the site. And so it wouldn't impact the liver as much, and would have been incredibly appealing. But since testing was going to cost so much, they ended up abandoning the effort. And they had similar advances in anesthetics and the rest. And it's just, you watch this technology die. So that's a shame. So anyway.
Anybody else? And say who you are.
Hi, my name's Elliot Hedman. I'm a PhD student here at the Media Lab. And I really am embracing this openness. I'm not an expert in the topic by any means, but I guess I have a question for you guys. Okay, so I'm making a product and I make it open. So how do I put myself in this picture? And I'm not a greedy person. I actually really want to change the world. But after I graduate, do I just say, okay, Google, go take my work and do awesome stuff with it? And then do I just say, okay, well, Google did that awesome thing with my thing, and now I'll do something else? So what should the students be thinking? How should I tune my mind so that I can be open, but at the same time have a future?
Well, I feel like I talked a lot. I don't want to,
I mean, this might sound counter to what I was saying before, but along the lines of what Joi was saying, that nobody should be in favor of abolition, nobody should assume that every project or every product or every innovation is the sort of thing that the world would be benefited by it being open. The place where open is critical is in the context of platforms that people get to build upon and adapt and to extend in ways that generate all sorts of new innovation. And that's why the TCP/IP platform became so critical. That's why, if in Yochai's work, you can see at each layer the way in which open plays a critical role in facilitating the innovation and growth at that layer, but coexists with proprietary at these layers. And I don't think anybody wants to suggest the picture is going to be the world would necessarily be great if everything were open. There's certain kinds of inventors for whom this kind of proprietary protection was good and valuable. My criticism of it is that even if in theory it's good and valuable, too often in practice the system is so unbelievably inefficient that you can't begin to manage it in a way that even makes sense on its own theory. Like it's supposed to be a property system, so you're supposed to be able to identify who owns what and negotiate around the lines of the property. But in the context of patents around software and all sorts of areas like that, nobody knows what the lines are. And so therefore, you've just got to buy 1 billion patents and acquire companies that own them so that you can have enough dust to throw up if anybody challenges you. So you can still criticize the system without criticizing the idea that certain kinds of innovation are going to need proprietary protection and benefit from it. And it's a good thing. It's like, we wouldn't hold it against you if we've got a certain product that requires that structure. I will hold it against you if you start turning certain layers of the internet into proprietary structures, like Apple has effectively done in certain ways around the iPhone technologies. I mean, I hold it against them. I would hold it against every company that does something like that. And we should be political in exactly that sense in resisting it. But that's different from saying everybody in this space should be giving away everything they do for free.
But, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
There's a different kind of tension as well. First be aware that ideas are relatively cheap. You will get money from your idea by going with the idea.
executing.
Executing. is it's the tacit knowledge you have around that idea, your willingness to actually carry it all the way into the into the marketplace, et cetera, et cetera. One of the biggest mistakes we made at Park in the early days is thought that we were the technological geniuses and our idea was worth 90% of the total market value. After you see what it actually takes to cross the chasm, valley of death into the real marketplace, I began to think we were worth about 10%. And Chris and I have been through many sobering kind of, trajectories here. So just be aware that the idea itself is often going to be less valuable than you think. But if you're willing to go with it, then it becomes a lot more valuable. And the other side, and I also have a conflicted sense. If you want to go out and raise money from a venture capitalist, it's a little bit hard to go say, hey, I have this great idea. I'm willing to go. I'm willing to be the CTO or the CEO of this thing. But, oh, by the way, there's no intellectual property. That's a tough conversation to have. It's not necessarily a legitimate situation because, they may put way too much weight on it, but just be aware that there is a tension there. Now, most of us doing startups end up selling them to big companies that already have other mechanisms to kind of develop these things, scale these ideas, and so on and so forth. And then that has to do with the kinds of relationships you really do have with that handoff process. But so this, I don't think it's quite. I don't think you're going to black and white answer from that point of view, and let alone from what you were saying, Larry.
So to add and generalize, because tacit knowledge was one of the things that I was hoping. When you started talking, I thought you would talk about tacit knowledge, but it's part of a general category of imperfections of transfer of information as a practical matter that have to do that mean that just sort of taking the idea and running with it is not as easy as it may seem. So particularly if you're talking about something that's software and the question of open source versus not open source, so much of it will be tending it, getting to the point that there's a second contributor, let alone any more than that. Then being in a network of people who actually contribute to each other, at which point, in addition to the tacit knowledge, there's the social capital in the particular community of developers, all of which are only easy to develop in the context of open as opposed to if it's all arm's length through contract, etc. You only can get people through being open in this particular way. And then the cluster of things together is something that needs to be bought without a patent, Now, are there discrete technologies? And are there VCs that have mistakes? For sure. But I think, if anything, software is a space where it's clearer than anywhere else how, by being open, getting complementary contributions, getting the thing adopted and implemented at a small level so that you actually have users, becomes something that's very hard for a company to just say, oh, I like that idea, and go do it, as opposed to, why on earth would you not come work for us?
And it actually reminds me of Cesar's thing about he'd rather have a dentist who knows how to do root canal than the Wikipedia entry on root canal. But I know Larry has to go, so I'm going to relieve Larry in exchange for letting me be late. But we'll take a few more questions. But see you later, Larry. Thanks. And I didn't see who was first. Constanza, were you next? So introduce yourself, and then we'll just take these two questions, and I think that's...
Hi, thanks, Joi. I'm Sasha Costanza-Chuck. I'm an assistant professor of civic media, and together with Ethan and Mitch, I'm a co-PI at the Center for Civic Media. And I'm really interested in this idea that openness beyond talking about patent and copyright, but let's think about open processes for designing the tools and technologies, which includes, I guess, moving beyond the smart group of people in a room who are going to build some really cool thing and actually building tools and systems together with users at the table, not just as testers of something that you've built, but actually from the ideation stage through rapid prototyping and testing and through the whole iterative design process. So I'm really curious to hear, I guess, each of your or some of your thoughts about opening up the entire process, not just in the IP sense, but actually opening processes to user participation and co-creation, and how that can be valuable for the next wave of innovation. Thanks.
So I've actually heard that exact question before, and I'm going to give you the exact same answer. Go do it. frankly, a lot of programmers are not going to value you until you show what it means and that it's valuable to them. Because most of the people who are working, for instance, in the open source space, they're handling their own problems. They're doing it for their own reasons, and they don't actually always care about the users so much as they care about themselves, the user. So go do it and show us what you mean.
So this is sort of a leading question because that's exactly what we're trying to do, and we're developing methods and tools and sort of sharing that out of the civic media space. But
so the only twist I would add to that is, in today's world, probably we get our competitive edge from learning faster than anybody else. So the ability to accelerate learning is a very key attribute. I think most of the reason people come to Google is because you're surrounded by smart people and you're actually picking up talent. You're developing talent faster in that kind of diverse environment, doing open things, doing things in general, but than most of the sites that I know. It's curious to me that one of the greatest accelerators of learning, for example, systems design, is open systems, because we get to actually open up the black boxes and see the processes involved in what actually went in those things. You don't learn much from a black box. You might use it, but you don't learn much from it. Well, the more and more processes we open up, that's where tremendous value really lies, and we get to then look at that, learn from that, improve that, tinker with that, because I'm a big believer that advancement happens through tinkering. You can't tinker with black boxes. And so I think this is an amazingly important kind of an issue.
So no black boxes here, by the way. Just
and I think it would be a mistake to interpret the claims, say, about open source software as claims that are primarily about IP. They're primarily about collaboration across traditional boundaries. So I thought you were going to talk about creation nets and all sorts of things like that, but this is all the time I just keep saying, here, read this particular set of pages, and pointing at you.
Read creation nets.
So I think it's not, so you say build it, and my sense is this is the core claim. One particular barrier can be IP. Another is management processes. Another is internal management processes. If everything has to go through a process engineer that's talking to a single employee as opposed to 5 people in a team around a workstation with no process engineers, that's also that.
So, you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Nikhil Jain, and I work at Qualcomm. I think what I have been struggling through the last hour or so was trying to define in my head what open meant.
What were you yammering about?
Yeah, and I think, one of the examples of a closed system is Apple, that traditionally you hear. But as I look around in the modern world, I see a lot of people building amazing dreams using Apple products. So in some sense, they are contributing to everything good. So I want to ask the following question to each of you. If you, in your definition, from your perspective, is open about IP, how I share what I think is new? Is open about the way I collaborate with each other? Is open a business model? And I think the simple answer is all of it, but I think that the real question in my mind is that even Linux was closed because it was controlled in how it was released, and there was one person that released it and so on. But so when you look at open, I'd like to figure out how I can define something that is open. And because I think in the long run, you want to extend this idea to hardware and databases and other stuff like that. And so that's my question to each of you.
So for me, when I think about open technologies broadly, I think to myself, it's not really truly open if I can't take it myself and do with it what I please. Do something that's off-label for what the original developers might have thought. So when you look at something like Linux, if I want to take Linux in a different direction, slap a real-time kernel around it back in '97, I would take it, I would wrap it up in my own scheduler, and I would go to town with that. And I could do that because of the license it was under. I often see people say that things are open when, in fact, you don't have that kind of freedom to innovate around it. And that's when it drives me crazy. But past that, I try not to define it too much because I don't want to restrict it, So, yeah.
I mean, my sense is a little bit like that is I like to think of openness as what amplifies collective tinkering. And because from tinkering we invent new things, we learn much more about what was done already, so on and so forth. But your question actually suggests something else that we don't talk much about. Basically, most of these open systems are themselves institutional innovations. If you look at Linux, it has a different constitution behind it than several of the other major open products. So one of the questions is, how do you want to structure kind of the institutional mechanisms that actually may organize the collective action, and then knows how to adjudicate disputes, and so on and so forth. These can be completely informal, but you look at, even if you move into what Joi and I do, World of Warcraft, you find every major guild actually has a constitution that actually governs how open things actually happen. And we downplay the brilliance of these institutional mechanisms that actually open us in freedom, but protect us from going crazy.
So that's a great question, and I think both of these are great answers, and I'm in some sense going to repeat some only, which is to say, first of all, openness is about freedom to operate, freedom to tinker, collaborate around without asking permission. And that has to do with the fact that what you're doing is you're harnessing different perspectives to a given class of resources and asking of questions. So the questions can be new, the processes can be new, and the resources can be used and recombined in new ways. And the more that you constrain the ability of who it is able to work on what towards what project, the less open you are. And then there are classes of constraints, and they can be intellectual property, and they can be organizational boundaries, and they can be institutional constraints. And all of these, and I think this is something that's critical about what you just said, JSB, is you need some structure within which to work. And the question is how you design the structure so as not to constrain that capacity of anyone to lead to a problem. And this will be different at different stages. If you look at Wikipedia today, as opposed to Wikipedia 5 years ago, as opposed to Wikipedia 9 years ago, you see the layering of institutions that continuously try to tie back to keeping that core question of who gets to work on what set of questions with what set of resources unconstrained, while at the same time maintaining constraints.
So it's a critical issue of how do you do structure and agency.
Well, and I mean, I think, and to riff on what you guys just said, and I think I'm going to accidentally get the last word here, but I mean, even society, right? Open society is basically a society that doesn't have the hubris or the arrogance to think that it can be centrally planned. And I think the idea is that when we talk about open systems, open networks, it's the ability for anyone to participate and contribute without asking permission, and the idea that the central planner isn't going to know the best, so they have to architect it in a way that it draws on the power of pull. And we know that open systems, I mean, at least if you live in America, you believe that the open system is better than a closed system. And we learned on the internet that this works, and that one person doesn't ever know the whole of it. And so when you have a designer of a closed system, like a Steve Jobs, what you have is somebody who has a problem that's constrained and simple enough so that one person can know the whole of it. And this gets back to your person byte, people byte thing. But when you get a system that's so complex, like we have in the network today, one company can no longer design the whole of it. And that's, I think, when you need to go open, is when you're trying to create a platform that becomes sufficiently complex that people use the parts in ways that the designers didn't anticipate. And otherwise, the designer has to anticipate everything, and you can't grow. And I think that, and so I think there's a complexity threshold and a scalability threshold. So if the simple parts can be closed, but when you get to those platforms that have to scale massively and everybody has to use, then you have to create these open networks. And it's kind of like a sandwich, where if you look at the ISO stack, where you have a layer of openness that creates an explosion of innovation with lots of proprietary systems, and then another layer that you have that's open. And so I think about it in terms of the relationship with complexity. But I think we're running out of time. I apologize. Well, I don't know. Couldn't the organizers tell me? I think the next thing starts in 5. Actually, I am the organizer, aren't I? I keep forgetting. It's like, I'm going to ask Dad. Oh, wait, I am Dad, you know. I think we can take one more question. We have 5 minutes till the next thing starts.
I'm Kasha Hayden from Software Agents, and I was just kind of curious, thinking about this from some of the sponsors' perspectives. So a lot of their companies are traditionally more closed. They don't have too many sort of open elements and some of the ways we've discussed open. So I'm just wondering if there is any incentive or any ideas for why they might make parts of their companies more open or different aspects, either using open as a definition of contributing without asking or being able to do what the designers hadn't intended, any of those definitions.
Well, I mean, you guys have the answers too, but I think that if you want to be part of an ecosystem, and you have, let's say you have a core competency around a whole variety of things, again, back to Cesar's and the earlier talks about these sort of networks of products, what you want is you want the world to become a platform for your products. And if you have a lot of core assets around, say, key technologies that could create an open standard, on top of which you do enormous business, but without which the infrastructure wouldn't be built. So, for instance, if you know, TCP/IP versus all of its competitors, it just went because it was open. If you were a company that knew how to build all kinds of equipment that would be enabled by TCP/IP, but you had the patents around TCP/IP, you would let them go. And so it's kind of figuring out what layer that you want to fight the battle and where you want to create the platform, because we know that open platforms scale. And then if you look at the fight between the big companies, these big conglomerates, what they're fighting always is like when IBM adopted Linux, right? What you do is you look for where your competitors are making all their money and make that open, and pick the layer where you're going to make all your money and make that closed. Then when you get enough of these guys fighting against each other, you kind of luck out and get open at a lot more layers. And, you know, so that's kind of how a variety of the internet opened. I mean, without IBM support, Linux probably wouldn't have gotten the kind of business adoption that it got. But it was really a decision that they made. And and Google, I think, does it. I mean, so if you have multiple layers of revenue, you can also open up certain layers. You know, I mean, the browser wars, in a negative way, was that too, when Microsoft decided it wasn't really open, it was free, but they gave away their browser and killed Netscape. But that's also, openness can be used in a very aggressive, self-interested way. I mean, not that all of our companies think about it that way. I mean, I think there's the very positive one, which is if you're trying to create an ecosystem of products, you want an open standard in order to interoperate. And if you know any open standards process, you can't allow encumbered technologies to enter the open, into open standard. But if you have the know-how, again, like the dentist with the root canal, I mean, unless you make it open, you're not going to be able to deploy your expertise into the system. And so I think if you're confident about your ability to continue to innovate in an area, it gives you a lot of benefit to create a platform on top of which to exercise that know-how.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I would add, and this is not across the street at Sloan Business School where I'd be talking about this, but if you think ecosystemically from a business point of view, the real question is how do you become a shaper of an ecosystem? Okay, that is a major business strategic issue. To be able to shape an ecosystem, you have to know exactly what to give away and what not to give away and how to operate, and then how to build a sense of trust through what you've given away with reciprocity. So, I mean, there's a whole major set of almost 21st century business issues that really underlie a fairly principled way to attack this problem.
Any last comments? Anyone want the last word? All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you for the great panel.